Hey y'all, it's entry number 88 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Dalton Schultz, tight end, Dallas Cowboys. We'll start with the positives with Dalton Schultz's fantasy profile. More potential opportunities. The Dallas Cowboys traded away Amari Cooper this past offseason to the Cleveland Browns. Amari Cooper has been one of the better wide receivers for the Cowboys the past few years, as he's had at least 70 or more receptions, 1,000 or more receiving yards, and 5 or more receiving touchdowns in 5 of his first 7 years in the NFL. And he's seen 100 or more targets in each of the past 2 seasons for the Cowboys, 130 targets in 2020 and 104 targets in 2021. With Amari Cooper gone, the only player clearly ahead of Schultz on the team's target totem pole is now CeeDee Lamb. It's possible we see Schultz's workload increase in 2022. The next major thing I really like about Dalton Schultz's fantasy profile is that he's got solid quarterback play. Over his last 37 games, 3 seasons, Dallas Cowboys starting quarterback Dak Prescott has totaled 949 completions on 1,414 passing attempts for 11,207 passing yards and 76 passing touchdowns to just 25 interceptions. On a per-game basis, this is 25.65 completions on 38.22 passing attempts for 302.89 passing yards and 2.05 passing touchdowns per game to just 0.68 interceptions per game. Having an above-average passer throwing him the ball makes it easier for Dalton Schultz to be solid in 2022 fantasy leagues. The last thing I really like about Dalton Schultz's fantasy profile this year is that he's in the optimal age for a tight end production. Dalton Schultz turned 26 years old in July. Fantasy football legend Mike Tagliere did the research and wrote an article showing that the prime age for fantasy football tight ends is between 25 years old and 32 years old. Being in the prime age for a fantasy tight end bodes well for Schultz in 2022. Moving on to some of the concerns with Dalton Schultz's fantasy profile. Average efficiency for a fantasy relevant tight end. Dalton Schultz averaged 1.75 yards per route run, the 11th best among tight ends, 7.8 yards per target, the 12th best among tight ends, 10.4 yards per reception, the 16th best among tight ends, and 1.25 yards per team passing attempt, the 9th best among tight ends according to Player Profiler. These numbers are solid, but he's going to need to take a step forward in the efficiency department or see even more targets in order to enter the top tier of fantasy tight ends. The next major concern I have with Dalton Schultz's fantasy profile is that he's not particularly athletic. Dalton Schultz isn't the most athletic tight end looking at his profile. He ran a 4.75 40-yard dash, which was in the 57th percentile among tight ends. I had a 116.0 burst score, which was in the 45th percentile among tight ends, an 11.40 agility score, the 71st percentile, and a 9.98 catch radius, which was in the 47th percentile according to Player Profiler. His more mediocre athleticism could prevent him from joining that elite tier of fantasy tight ends. The last major concern I have with Dalton Schultz's fantasy profile is Mike McCarthy's history with tight ends. While head coach Mike McCarthy is not the primary offensive play caller of the Dallas Cowboys, it is important to note that his tight end room generally has gotten less usage and lower production than the league average tight end room over the course of his career as a head coach or offensive coordinator. This is a minor concern for now, but if Mike McCarthy decides to take over play calling duties at any point this year, this could be bad news for Dalton Schultz's fantasy value. Some additional thoughts on Dalton Schultz's fantasy profile. In 2021, Dalton Schultz finished as the TE3 in Standard, with 130.8 total fantasy points and 7.7 fantasy points per game. The TE3 in half PPR formats, with 169.8 total fantasy points and 10.0 fantasy points per game. and the TE3 in full PPR formats with 208.8 total fantasy points and 12.3 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Dalton Schultz had 4 out of 17 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 5 out of 17 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 4 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 3 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 1 out of 17 games with over 20 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Yards after the catch. Dalton Schultz had the 6th most yards after the catch, 348 among tight ends in 2021. He averaged the 17th most yards after the catch per reception, with 4.5 among tight ends in 2021 according to Pro Football Reference. Personal opinion. Dalton Schultz is currently going off the board as tight end 6, about pick 65 overall, on ESPN, and tight end 6, about pick 57 overall, on Yahoo. He's in the right ballpark in terms of tight end range, with the TE6 to TE9 tier of tight ends, where it's 50-50 on whether or not they can make the jump into the elite tier or not, alongside Dallas Goedert, TJ Hawkinson, and Zach Ertz. Schultz is probably the highest floor guy in this tier, given the workload that he should see in Dallas's offense, but his ceiling doesn't seem quite as high as Goedert or Hawkinson's due to his average athleticism. Personally, I am largely avoiding the tight ends in this tier at their current prices to get wide receivers and running backs in this draft range. Among tight ends specifically, I would personally draft him as TE8 behind the big 5 tight ends: Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, George Kittle, Kyle Pitts, and Darren Waller, and Goedert and Hawkinson, since I would prefer to roll the dice on their talents leading to a breakout season than betting on Schultz, who seems like more of a situational-based player. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. I couldn't find a charity that Dalton Schultz officially supports, so here's a link to Dak Prescott's My Cause My Cleats for the Faith, Fight, Finish Foundation by Dak Prescott. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.